What's up, Hydroplant personnel? I'm Quackers Co., and this is the fish fry for March 25th, being held at Fission Hydroplant. Our cookware for this rotation is the blaster, the sloshing machine, the bloblobber, and the heavy splatling. Fission is a small but incredibly paintable map, and our composition does lack some wall paintability, but as long as everybody's focusing on painting some walls, this map gets painted pretty quickly. This composition does offer some pretty interesting abilities for us to use, and I want to touch base on what those abilities are right quick. With the blaster, it does a really good job at painting inside corner walls really well. The sloshing machine causes area of effect damage while its projectile is in the air, so as long as you're firing slightly above or slightly to the side of enemies, you'll be able to cause some extra damage. The bloblobber's range is based on how far the blobs can bounce, so as long as you fire those projectiles to go the longest distance before they start bouncing, it'll give you the longest range of the entire composition. And the heavy splatling has some incredible range no matter where it's at in its charge. As long as you keep these special abilities in mind, it'll make it a little bit easier to cause some extra damage to enemies, as well as keeping this map just a little bit better painted. That way, when things get crazy, we can get out of that basket death pit and get ourselves to safety. Fission Hydroplant has a pretty interesting shoreline, with it wrapping all the way around the map, and the right side with the zigzag ramps easily being the most dangerous part. But since there's 3 different spawning locations where priority targets can come from, there's going to be a large chance that either you or your teammates are going to start focusing on that corner. If you see that all your teammates are focusing on that corner, try to keep yourself right there near the basket. This allows any targets that spawn on the long shoreline or the left shoreline to move straight to the basket, allowing for some easy lureable eggs, and a chance to lure some of those lessers away from the corner, allowing your teammates to focus a little bit more on those bosses. As hazard levels rise, it's going to be harder to hold that basket area as the match continues. So try to keep a steady flow of attacking and retreating, focusing on what is spawning, that way you can take out some of those shoreline priority targets really quickly. That blaster and the bloblobber have it the easiest on taking out stingers and fish sticks, so make sure your response on these targets are as fast as possible all throughout the match. The size of this map also makes it really dangerous to linger there at the shoreline for any time at all. So if you ever go down there, keep your awareness tight on where stuff is coming from, that way you can get those eggs moving and get out of there quickly. For our occurrences here at Fission Hydroplant, we can actually find it pretty easy to survive on a glowflies wave as long as we remain on the small platform on the left and jumping in between it and the larger platform, but that way we can lure the glowflies into smart areas in case we want to put in eggs or revive teammates. Try to be careful about using any wall clean techniques here at Fission Hydroplant. Things can get really wacky out of nowhere, but as long as you can focus on moving the targets to smart areas, using that physics to your advantage, you'll find it a little bit easier to survive. But you gotta make sure that you paint the walls and as much of the turf as possible around these 2 platforms. That way if you get knocked off, you have a bit more of a chance to survive and maybe even be that clutch moment for your team. On a griller's wave, we always want to get that griller as close to the basket as possible before we stun it or splat it. By using that wall right next to the basket, you can lure the griller next to the basket and then go on top of the platform to make him go backwards, getting him as close to the basket as possible. Try to utilize these tricks of moving the grillers around whilst also maintaining small fry control, and that should make griller waves not so terribly difficult. The bloblobber will probably have it the easiest on dealing with the small fry, but if you can keep that aim tight with the sloshing machine, making sure that area of effect damage causes damage to the small fries, it'll probably have it the easiest with the small fry control. A high tide at Fission Hydroplant doesn't change up too much from the gameplay on a normal tide. This is the moment where the fish sticks will become a little bit more detrimental to our mobility, but they'll also become the best tools for getting a vantage point and a little bit of safety, that way you can deal some damage to some of these targets. High tides at Fission also need a good focus on taking out salmon lids and steel eels. You can take out the steel eels while they're spawning, making them a pretty easy target, and the salmon lids can be easily used as tools for controlling some of these lanes. Just make sure that if you see a teammate that's using one, try not to take it out and focus on some other target. They got enough on their hands, as they'll need to be activating that salmon lid as much as possible to make sure that the lessers don't drop down on them. And just because we're on a high tide doesn't mean you shouldn't paint those walls in the hallway corridors. In fact, it gives you a little bit more of a reason to have those walls painted, as whenever you're on those higher platforms, if you get hit by an enemy and sent flying, those walls are your last vestiges of hope. Even if the wall isn't painted all the way up, as long as you're holding that B button as you go into the wall, you'll be able to charge up a squid surge and get up to that platform. And if the top of that platform is looking too dangerous, you can just wall jump to the other side, where there might be a little bit more safety. Luckily on a glowflies occurrence, a high tide doesn't change too much. You'll just have to make sure that you have those walls that much more painted, and be focusing on holding that B button when you go into the wall. That way you have a little bit more of a chance of getting out of there before you go flying into the water or getting attacked by the horde. And the same thing goes with the Griller's Wave. We have all the same walls and platforms that we would use on a normal tide, so just make sure you focus on that small fry control and putting in all those eggs as quick as possible. A Goldie Seek at Gone Fission can be a little bit confusing sometimes, but just like with most Goldie Seek waves, as long as all 4 players are opening up a valve right at the beginning of the wave, you have a lot more of a chance of finding that Goldie quicker, or getting some information to know where that Goldie might be. Just make sure you're really careful about knocking all the eggs out of the Goldie too far away from the basket. If some teammates are knocking those eggs out right by the shoreline, just make sure your response on finding that Goldie again is as quick as possible, and hopefully those teammates are running those eggs that they knocked out. Don't forget to ping this way to remind your teammates where the closer eggs are. On a Mothership occurrence, our composition has some pretty good range, so it should be pretty easy to maintain some Chinook control all throughout the wave. This range also does give us the opportunity for attacking that Mothership on approach, or if you want the maximum egg count, wait for that Mothership to connect to the basket, and then start launching attacks onto the top of it. That way you can splash some Chinooks and cause some damage to the Mothership, spawning those eggs right there by the basket. Be careful about those coolers that linger there on the shoreline, as they'll put a lot of lessers right on you when that Mothership's on approach. On a low tide Mothership at Gone Fission, Chinooks have a tendency of landing pretty far behind the basket, so try to make sure that you either have 1 or 2 people there on the back side of the basket, as well as 2 people on the front side, and try not to linger too close to your teammates at any one moment. That way you can keep taking out those Chinooks, spawning more golden eggs throughout the wave. On a Quahog charge with this composition, I would say the Blob Lobber and the Sloshing Machine have the best mobility, but as long as 2 players are always maintaining themselves in the turrets, keeping the Quahogs at bay, the Quahog charges usually go pretty easily. On a Mudmouth occurrence, this composition should go pretty easy on keeping some control on those lessers. As long as you're making sure the blaster shots are hitting as many enemies as possible, using the area of effect damage of the Sloshing Machine, and making sure that all your shots of the Blob Lobber are hitting, it should be a pretty smooth wave. And don't forget on Wave 3 Mudmouths to activate those specials and get those maximum egg numbers. On a Giant Tornado occurrence on Gone Fission, there's a bunch of choke points where those lessers have it easy to overrun us and knock us into the water or just splat us immediately. So whenever you're running eggs, try to make sure you move them as quick as possible, and then whenever the lessers start dropping, try to make sure that someone's always causing damage to them as they're dropping. More focus on keeping lessers under control will make it easier in case one person is being really daring on running those eggs. But the smartest play would be for the heavy splatling player to chill back and just deal that support damage. Gone Fission has a tendency of getting really crazy whenever shoreline priority targets aren't dealt with, so make sure your response is quick and fast so that way you can lure those targets and get those egg numbers up really high. This map can be really good for overfishing as long as you're controlling it right. Okay, let's get into the cookware. Our first cooking utensil is the blaster. As I mentioned before, any inside corner is really easy to paint with any blaster. It's also really easy to take out stingers and fish sticks with blasters. But one thing to consider is this weapon is our first slot weapon, so it should do a really good focus on painting walls and running eggs. But don't forget to use that blast to cause as much damage to opponents as possible. If that blob lobber is sending blobs everywhere, there's an easy chance that your blast or a blob is going to splat something. It's not the smartest to get the blaster down to the shoreline, but as long as you have a clear line path to take out a stinger, then take it out quick and get back to the basket. The blaster is one of the best weapons to sacrificially stay there by the basket, and then when all the enemies get all gathered up, climb a wall, and then use that big blast to cause as much damage as possible. When you want to take out a fish stick, I found it a little bit better to aim on the left side of the rotation. That way if your blast goes a little bit too far, it causes some kind of damage to the stick. I give the blaster a wall paint score of 7 out of 10 here at Gone Fission. As I said, it can paint inside corners really well, giving you some pretty interesting escape strategies. It also paints those corner walls pretty quickly too, giving you a big spot of paint on the wall to utilize. Our second cooking utensil is the Sloshing Machine. The Sloshing Machine has that area of effect damage as that projectile is flying through the air. So if you're keeping your aim tight, you can cause a lot of damage to lessers when you want to focus on a boss. You can also use this to cause some damage to a scrapper if you want to focus your damage on a Quahog that's approaching from behind him. It can also be utilized to take out a fish stick in just 2 shots from the ground level. You just have to make sure that you aim on the right side of the rotation and use the area of effect damage and try to make sure that projectile does not come in contact with any of the enemies. You gotta make sure that the area of effect is what's causing the damage. It's also helpful to remember that that projectile causes just as much damage if it's fired at a high arc and it lands on something, making it easy to take out Salmon lids without even seeing the target. Utilize that range and area of effect, and the sloshing machine is easily one of the best salmon run weapons. I give the sloshing machine a wall paint score of 5 out of 10 here at Gone Fission. It puts some pretty good globs on the wall, but considering the slow fire rate, you'll want to make sure that you have as many walls painted before the match is going, that way you don't have to lean so heavily on painting the walls mid-match. Our third cooking utensil is the blob lobber. The blob lobber's range is based on how far its blobs can bounce. So if you jump whenever you fire, your shot does go just that much further. And as long as you're keeping that range in mind, you can send a steady wave of blobs all around this map. The way the blobs bounce also help it out with its wall paint ability. Bouncing those blobs in between the corridors allows you to paint both sides of them pretty quickly. The range of the blob lobber also helps it out with taking care of stingers. So as long as you can see that stinger right whenever it spawns, start sending blobs out, that way your teammates know they don't need to get down there. You can take it out from these upper platforms. It's also fantastic for dealing with those big shots. The blob lobber does have some pretty good mobility, so if you want to stay sacrificially there by the basket, it can handle those lessers and handle the bosses as they're coming in. Just make sure you're not sleeping on this weapon's paint ability and its turf coverage. Keep it going and try to send those blobs everywhere as much as possible. I give the blob lobber a wall paint score of 9 out of 10 here at Gone Fission. As long as you're working the angles and bouncing those blobs in the right way, it can paint this map pretty dang quick. Our last cooking utensil is the heavy splatling. The heavy splatling takes a little while to charge up, but its range is available at any point in that charge. So as long as you're keeping a good balance between taking out lessers and taking out bosses, that provides plenty of support for higher mobility weapons to get in, grab some eggs, and hopefully toss them towards you. Try to be careful on finding yourself just running away with this weapon. There's plenty of moments where you can get yourself a quarter or a half charge to take out a cohawk that's getting too close to you. It also works incredibly well on taking out fish sticks from the ground level. And if you decide to get the heavy or the blob lobber on top of a fish stick, firing in the opposite direction with both of these weapons can take out that fish stick really quickly from above. It also gives you a really good vantage point to take out some other enemies. The heavy splatling will also have it the easiest on painting some of these walls at the beginning of a wave. Just make sure as soon as you get there that you charge this weapon up and paint those walls as quick as possible. All the walls, corners, and ramps are paintable here around the basket, so get them all painted, that way this heavy can get around and cause that damage. If you're dealing with a stinger, try to make sure that when you release its charge fire, that you fire at the base and move your aim upwards, that way you can take out that stinger just a little more quickly. I give the heavy splatling a wall paint score of 8 out of 10 here at Gone Fission. As long as you're utilizing its range to paint some of these walls, it can give you some extra movement opportunities and strategies in case you want to go into that basket area, drop off an egg, and then get out. The king to grace us with his presence on this rotation will be the Cohozuna. And the Cohozuna always needs a good balance of using the damage from your main weapon and using those eggs to cause some massive damage. So try not to get too much tunnel vision on firing at the Cohozuna. Keep an eye out for what bosses are spawning and what weapon you have and how you can take them out the quickest to get some of those golden eggs. And remember to always hold on to one egg at all times. That way if you need to, you can use that egg to take out a boss, spawning 3 more golden eggs. And try to make sure that you're using that special that you have before it gets too late into the wave. It can easily be used to take out some of those shoreline bosses, or to clear the area around where you're fighting or a bunch of eggs are at, that way you can keep that damage output going. The highest DPS weapon that we have is the heavy splatling, but it's got the lowest mobility. So if any weapon wants to get close and personal with that Cohozuna, luring him around to smart areas, it's going to want to be the blob lobber. Just make sure that the area is painted, that way if you need to get away, you can. And the fish fry usually comes out before the stage rotation. So if you want to catch these updates when they're hot and fresh, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell. And if you want other fellow Grizzco employees to receive these tips, make sure you like and share the video. Bye-bye. To give the fish fry an algorithm boost, just comment what your favorite or least favorite weapon is of this composition. One of my main weapons is the blob lobber, so I'm going to give it to the blob lobber. Just make sure those blobs are going everywhere, and this weapon is a joy to use. Alrighty guys, bye-bye.